Right, welcome back, and we hope you enjoyed a nice cup of coffee. And with us now is Matteo Maggiori. Is that how I say it, Matteo? Maggiori.
That's correct.
Welcome, all the way from America, so bright and early. And Matteo will be speaking to us about the new geography of capital. So we're all ears. Over to you.
Thank you. So one thing that I would like everybody to do, if you're not familiar with this mode of presentation, is if you put your mouse on top of where my screen is and you click on the three little dots, you should have an option to pin the video, and that you can make as big or small as you like. And I'm gonna not share my screen, but just use the slides here. So this is a joint project. It's with my usual co-authors, Brent Neiman, who's at the University of Chicago, and Jesse Schrager. They're the better people on the paper. And really the best person on the paper is Antonio Coppola, as a PhD student at Harvard, who's been fantastic on this project. What are we doing? We're trying to figure out some very basic things around the allocation of capital globally. In particular, we're trying to figure out how capital flows from large developed investors like the US and the EMU to emerging markets. And here I'm going to show you an example that comes from the oil company Petrobras. They're a Brazilian oil giant, and they do get capital from foreigners, but the way they do it is more intricate than one might think at first. In particular, if one were to look at the official data of the US and Europe, what their investors report holding of bonds issued by this Brazilian company, you would find that they report zero. Now that seems strange because we know Petrobras to be a large issuer of bonds. So what is happening? What is happening is that Petrobras has a subsidiary, you can see it here in the Cayman Islands, called Petrobras International Finance. And this subsidiary issues a lot of bonds that the American and European investors buy. For example, the Americans buy 1 billion worth of those, and the European buy another billion worth of those. But it doesn't stop there. The capital structure, or how capital flows, it's more complex than that. In particular, Petrobras also has a series of subsidiaries in the Netherlands. And the subsidiaries themselves issue bonds. And the bonds are being held again by the American and the European investors. You can see there is 5 billion held by the American investors, 6 billion held by the European investors. So once you sum up the holdings that the European and American investors have in the subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands and the Netherlands, all of a sudden you reach a very different conclusion about the exposure of American and US investors to Petrobras. In fact, rather than concluding that there is zero, you will conclude that there is somewhere around 14 billion. What I would like to convince you in the rest of the talk is that Petrobras is not the exception. This is just an example, but they're really very much the rule. The most large multinationals will behave this way. And what this means is that it creates a challenge for how we think about global capital allocations, because it doesn't make it transparent what the exposures really are when you look at, for example, public data. Now, if you wanted to understand one company, it might be possible with Googling it. But if you wanted to understand the universe of all securities out there, it gets a little bit more challenging. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to sort of try to create a systematic algorithm to think about these positions all together and figure out, after we've done this, what do we learn, which new facts emerge or change nature about basic knowledge of international capital. How big of a deal is this? So tax havens right now account for more than 10% of cross-border portfolio flows. For the US, they're a staggering amount. So 14% of the US foreign portfolio holdings are in the Cayman Islands alone. If you sum up all tax haven destinations, you're closer to something like 30%. So it is really a very big part of the foreign assets of these countries. Unfortunately, on top of that, it's not a big part that is randomly drawn. If this was like a random draw of the data, you might be tempted to say, let's just ignore it, and a lot of the conclusions that we're going to draw from the rest of the data are still going to be correct. What I will show you today is that unfortunately, it is not a random part. It is skewed in some particular dimensions, so that ignoring it might cause you to lead to get the wrong conclusions about the economics that you're trying to study. Similarly, if you flip it and you think about the corporate side, how big of a deal is the use of these tax haven jurisdictions for corporate financing? Well, right now they account for about 10% of all corporate financing and nearly 50% of anything that crosses borders. So there again, they're a major part of the show that we would like to understand, and we're by no means the first set of people to think that this is a very big deal. In fact, this has been understood for a long time. What we're bringing to the table is a way to do it systematically and also in a meaningful sense, as I will describe, open source, so that other researchers or central bankers can use it and build on it. Before I even get to what we do, what are some basic takeaways, just so that we don't get lost into the details of the talk, and we just keep in mind, ultimately, once you redo all this, what emerges? Probably the one good example is China. So I mentioned at the beginning that what tax havens have really done is they made it very difficult to understand who's exposed to whom. If China has, for example, a major crisis, how big are the losses going to be around the world? How big are the negative wealth effect on, say, European or American households? Answering that question is surprisingly complicated. Why? Because if you look at the US official data, the exposure to China looks rather small. It's somewhere around 150 billion in the portfolio. In reality, it's about 600 billion bigger than that. It's closer to 750 billion. What is the difference accounted for? It's accounted for by companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, that are located in the Cayman Islands, and therefore not considered Chinese from a perspective of the official data. But of course, for all intent and purposes, they are Chinese. And that one is masking this quite big exposure that we don't normally take into account. It's more general than China. In general, I will show you that the developed countries' exposure to large emerging economies is much bigger than one would conclude in the official data. This, for example, will also affect South Africa. Companies like Naspers do a fair amount of their capital sourcing abroad, and that one doesn't show up in the direct holdings of foreigners in South Africa. Corporate financing is going to be more important than sovereign in some cases. Why? Because sovereigns almost always go into international markets under their own name. So they're always fully captured by the existing statistics. The corporates, because they tend to use tax havens so much, they tend to be less captured by the official statistics. And that rebalances the idea of how big is the corporate in getting foreign capital, the corporate sector. There's also some foreign investment that should just be considered domestic. So each country tends to buy in tax havens a lot of securities issued by its own corporations, a form like home bias in tax havens. But that means that what truly is a domestic investment is being considered a foreign investment because of this sort of round tripping through a tax haven. In most of the talk, I will be focusing on what I call multilateral exposures. So it's not the US versus China, it's really the US versus the Caymans, it's really the US versus China. At the very end of the talk, I will instead try to look at a net impact, as in if something that is going on in tax havens leads us to get the wrong conclusions about, for example, the net foreign assets of a country. And in particular, I will highlight that China, who is one of the major creditors to the rest of the world, is the third largest creditor to the rest of the world after Japan and Germany, that their net foreign asset position, we compute it to be half as big as it is in the official data because of these companies in tax havens. But it'll take a little bit of work to get there. So that's the game plan. Now let's start from the beginning. First, let me highlight the difference between residency and nationality. In particular, there are cases where residency and nationality are the same. So let me first define what residency and nationality even are. Most of you, at a central bank will be very familiar with it. Almost all statistics that we produce tend to be residency-based. What does that mean? It means that they ascribe almost all of the activity to the immediate actor. What does that mean? If I go back to the Petrobras example, if the bonds are being issued by a corporation in the Cayman Islands, anybody that buys them is buying an asset in the Cayman Islands issued, for example, by a company in the financial sector. Nationality is a bit of a different concept. It's a concept that takes those same bonds and says, well, not really. They should be considered a liability of an oil company in Brazil because that is the nationality and sector of the company that is ultimately deploying the capital, that controls the subsidiary. There are many cases where the two concepts are identical. I mentioned governments. When the South African government issues bonds on international markets, it does so under its own name, and therefore the two concepts are identical. The South African government does not set up a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands to issue sovereign debt, even when it does so on international markets. There are some cases where it's not obvious what you want to use. Let me give you a typical example. If you look at Toyota Motors North America, it is the US subsidiary of the Toyota Motors Group, the Japanese group. It's a big part of the group overall. About 60% of the worldwide revenue in the group come from this subsidiary. It's a very large issuer of dollar bonds, and American investors buy them. Now, whether you want to consider those investments as being made by US investors in Japan or by US investors domestically really depends on the question you're looking at. For example, if you're trying to look at the domestic labor market impact of Toyota, then you definitely want to consider it an American company. You want to take the residency principle. If instead you're trying to look at how the Toyota Motor Group worldwide raises capital and controls the capital allocation within the group, then you definitely want to consolidate it to be a Japanese entity worldwide. What we're gonna do is gonna allow you to do either or. It's gonna depend on the researcher and what they're going after, which treatment you might prefer of the data. I'm gonna argue, however, that there is at least one case where for almost all intent and purposes in economics, we would prefer the nationality view to the residency view, and that's the tax havens. Why? Because the Cayman Islands has about a $2 billion GDP. It has roughly 4 trillion worth of assets. So we know that nothing, everybody understands that nothing is happening locally, that the capital is coming in and then flowing somewhere else where it's being used. It's not being used locally in the economy. And so we don't love the idea of ascribing those activities to the immediate actors in the Cayman Islands. We would like to know where else in the world we should be thinking that they're going. And that's going to be one thing that nationality helps us with. Later, I will review also different concepts for nationality. For example, allocating multinational based on their sales worldwide, not to just one country or the other, but to a multitude of countries, depending on where they're making their sales. But those are the concepts that we're going to be playing around with. Now, let me sort of tell you at least the highlights of how we do this. It's certainly something that's a little bit more complex than I'm going to make it out to be. If you're actually interested in doing it, I suggest you read the long appendix. But if you're not interested in doing it, you just want the highlight, that's all I'm going to do today for a slide or two. So in principle, these companies record where they're issuing bonds around the world and how they control each subsidiary of the group. What is a little bit challenging is doing it systematically. So what we ended up doing is we ended up collecting 7 different data sets. You can see them here. These are commercial data, so you can approach the vendors and buy them. And each of them will record some piece of information that tells you that company A owns company B. It might also tell you that company A is located in one country and company B is located in another. What we do is we try to put them all together and harmonize them. So the sum of all the data sets is actually bigger. The value is bigger than the sum of the parts. Why? The typical example, which is the most trivial, is imagine one data set tells me that A owns B, but another data set tells me that B owns C. And I really only get to the full picture that A owns C once I merge them together. Now that's the simplest example. A lot of the value added actually comes from, they cover a slightly different set of companies. A lot of the value added comes from seeing the same link multiple times. And if they disagree, figuring out how many of these data sets report that A owns B rather than B owns A. So you get a lot of power from sort of trying to glean all the information you can get from all of these data sources together. The algorithm is available online for download. So you can go on our website, theglobalcapitalAllocation.com, and you can just simply download it. And it has been made with the user in mind. So it's fairly transparent. There are many more decisions than what I just highlighted. And as I mentioned, some of these decisions you might want to make them, and some of them for your purposes you might not want to make them. And the algorithm also allows you to do that. Most of all, I think, we wanted it to be a bit of a building block so that other people can also use it and not have to reinvent it from scratch. And in particular, you don't have to have all of the sources. The algorithm will run with any subset. So if you go online, you will see that we provide you the first few lines as an example of what the dataset has to be formatted as. And then at the very top of the algorithm, you tell it which of the datasets are you using. And so even if you only have one or two, you can get going. Now, there is no guarantee that one or two will do as well as the universe, but it's certainly a way to get going and at least understand what's happening. So I encourage you to sort of take a look at this. What does the finished product look like? Let me give you an example. So here I'm looking at corporate bonds. And again, we go back to Petrobras. So I start from a company in the Cayman Islands. And what the algorithm tells me is that this company has an ultimate parent, which is the Brazilian mother company. And it tells me that of this particular bond, there's about 12 billion. A second example, for example, it's GATS Capital. It's a Luxembourg-based company, but the algorithm tells me that it's owned by Gazprom in Russia. It's a subsidiary of that group. If you look at equities, for example, I mentioned them before and we will go deep into them. When most of us buy Alibaba on the New York Stock Exchange, what we're really buying is the Alibaba Group Holding Limited. That's a Cayman Island-based company. Of course, the algorithm tells you that they're affiliated with a company by the same name, roughly speaking, but in China. And so it's changing not the company itself, but the nationality of the company. It's telling me it's not a Cayman company. It's registered there, but it's a Chinese company. And you can see that there's about $500 billion worth of this stuff. And you can imagine the algorithm being, many of these rows. There's about 27 to 30 million securities. And for each of them, it will tell you the immediate actor, the ultimate parent, and the countries. Now, of course, that just describes what is out there. It doesn't tell me who owns it. And if we are interested in how capital gets allocated, I don't want to just know where the securities are and who are the parent company. I also want to know who buys them. And to do that, we merged in holdings data coming from some of our previous work and plus some new work. So the data that we use, the benchmark data, is data on open-end mutual funds and ETFs. What these are is, think of seeing the balance sheet of PIMCO every quarter for every one of their funds at the security level. So every bond that each of the funds own, every equity, and so on. So you want to think that we're not seeing George Soros, we're seeing PIMCO, Vanguard, BlackRock, the big mutual fund houses. There's about 33 trillion worth of wealth. I think by now we're closer to 37. We keep updating the data. And we're going to focus for this talk on 9 developed markets. What does that mean? It means the US, the EMU, so 9, I'm considering the entire Eurozone to be one single country. Canada, the UK, Australia, Norway, some of the big developed countries for which the data has very good coverage of the holdings. And of course, we're not interested so much in learning what the mutual funds do. We're interested in learning whether this is representative of the overall investment at the country level. And we're well cognizant that mutual funds are a very large international investors. For some countries like the US, they're going to be the largest international investor by a long shot, but they're not the only ones. There are pension funds, there are insurance companies, there are hedge funds, there are banks. So what we did, we ended up borrowing a technique from really from trade that I will describe in a second, and making the following assumption, which I want to highlight. Not that the mutual funds are representative of overall investment, but that within each year, asset class and bilateral country pair, fund holdings are representative of the universe of portfolio investment. What does that really mean? It means that it's completely fine if insurance companies hold a lot less equity than corporate bonds compared to mutual funds overall. It's completely fine if insurance companies invest a lot more in the Caymans compared to mutual funds with respect to other destinations. Those are on focusing on, say, US investment in the Netherlands in 2017 in corporate bonds. Then the mutual fund selection of securities within that year asset class and destination is relatively similar to other investor types. So it allows for a fair amount of heterogeneity, but still makes some assumptions. There's two cases that we've added recently where we could test it. So we collected the universe of portfolio holdings for all insurance companies of the US. And we've also collected all the securities holdings of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the oil fund. And what we can ask is, would we have reached different conclusions for the US and Norway if instead of using their respective mutual funds data, we used in one case only the insurance company's data, and in the other case, only the sovereign wealth fund data? And I will show you that the answer is no. We will reach pretty similar conclusions. So that gives us some comfort that this assumption at the level at which we're making it holds relatively well. Okay, so that's the plan. Now, let me show you what the technique is. It's really quite straightforward. So here I'm taking as an example the 2017 US holdings of corporate bonds abroad. So on the rows, what I have is the destination by residency. So the way to think about Brazil here is we're looking at US investments that are made in Brazil by residency. The way we're looking at the Caymans here is the same thing. Now, what does this 1.4% in the middle mean? It says that in the columns, I have where in percentage the investments get reallocated by our work once we move to nationality. So that one immediately tells us that only 1.4% of all corporate investments that corporate bond holdings that the US has in 2017 in the Caymans stays in the Caymans by nationality. So it's all going somewhere else. Where is it going? 20% is being moved to Brazil, 33% to China, 13% is going back to the US. It's very often securities issued by companies that have as a nationality the country of the investor, a form of home bias. Now, once you have these matrices, imagine having as many matrices as there are investors, asset classes, and years in our data. And by the way, all of these matrices are available online. So each of them will have hundreds of rows with all the countries filled in. You can inspect them. They're kind of interesting. They tell you all the input-output structure of where capital goes by residency and by nationality. Once you have them, you can use them to restate national statistics or official data at the country level. Let me give you an example. Suppose that we start from the US. So the US has wonderful data collected by the Treasury International Capital that essentially collects data on a residency basis of where the US makes investments bilaterally all around the world for bonds and equities. And here I'm looking at US corporate bond holdings abroad. Imagine taking this column of official data and multiplying it by that matrix, and then summing up at the end all the destination. By doing that simple calculation, you now transform the data from residency to nationality with the representativeness assumption that I just mentioned. I'm going to present two versions. One I'm going to call tax haven only. What that means is that I'm only going to use the rows of the matrix that correspond to tax haven. So I'm going to reallocate investments made in the Cayman Islands, but I'm not going to reallocate investments made in the UK. Full nationality, it's different. It reallocates investments irrespective of where they're made in the world. In fact, including US domestic investment. Let me start with the tax haven only. So what do we learn? If I go back to the case of Brazil, one thing that we learn is that in the official data, the US investors are reported to only hold 8 billion worth of Brazilian corporate debt. Now that's rather low, and immediately you can see why. If we switch to the tax haven only view, we now conclude that the US owns 50 billion, where in China, whereas the official data tells you US investors hold 3 billion of corporate bonds, the tax haven only allocation already shows you is 47 billion. In Russia, where they owe less than 1 billion, so we're running it down to zero, actually there's about 12 billion. That should remind you of, if the US is buying the bonds issued by Gazprom in Luxembourg, those are being counted in the official data as US investments in the Eurozone. But under the tax haven only view, we're reallocating them to be US investments in Russia. Now, where is the capital coming from? Of course, it's coming from the tax havens. You can see that the Caymans go from 80 billion to 1, Bermuda goes from 30 to 0, Ireland goes from 63 to 24. So what is happening is capital is moving out of the tax havens and is going to these large emerging markets. And it's not just this one. I mean, South Africa, for example, is part of it. South African companies like Naspers where the investments are originally located in tax havens. So suppose we take the following view. Let's put Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa together and ask, if I look at the official data, what fraction of the external portfolio or the external bond portfolio, large developed countries, gets allocated to the BRICS? You can see that in the, this is just summing up the previous column for the US. The allocations look very small in the official data. The US invests only 2% of its portfolio in the BRICS. The EMU is also about 2.5%. You can see that all of the developed countries are pretty low. But once you switch to a nationality view, they all go up quite a bit. So the US, more than triples. The EMU is now at 7%. So it's telling you this is a general phenomenon where emerging markets are issuing bonds to subsidiaries in these tax havens. The developed investors are buying them. And so on the asset side of the developed investors, the emerging markets look rather small because a lot of these investments are being counted as not being made in emerging markets, but as being made in tax havens. You get a pretty different conclusion of the portfolio exposures once you start looking at the data this way, which we thought was pretty interesting. Now, I want to give you a sense of the richness of the data. So all of these estimates, by the way, are freely available on our website, year by year and country by country. You can download them, you can play around, you can look at South Africa, where the capital is coming from. Here, I'm gonna show you an example for the US. So let me just sort of zoom in a tiny bit. Suppose that you know where the capital is ending. You know that at the end, there's $42 billion of investments in Brazil. But you can also ask, where is it coming from? So you can see that 16 billion is coming from the Caymans. Some of it is coming from Luxembourg. A big chunk is coming from the Netherlands. Similarly, if you're looking at US investments in China in bonds, there's about 44 billion. And you can, again, trace out where did it start? 12 billion started in the British Virgin Islands, 27 billion in the Cayman Islands. Some of it started in other tax havens like Bermuda. A tiny sliver came from the Netherlands. So what you can imagine doing is having this whole sort of matrix of where do we start and where we end up from for all of these countries for 2007 to today. And to be perfectly honest, we haven't even started analyzing this. Lots of interesting questions about how it changes over time, how is it different across countries, how is it impacted by policy, for example, like capital controls, or by policies that have to do with taxation, regulation. That's an open question. But I do want to show you quickly that they're really far from stable. So this is for 2017. Here's what that one looks like in 2012. You can see that China is much smaller. Russia is a hell of a lot bigger. Brazil is still sort of medium-sized. If you go back to 2007, you find China being even smaller and Russia being quite big already. So there's a lot of richness there that we haven't exploited yet. Now I want to highlight one pattern moving away from bonds for equity, because it is truly gigantic and is going to lead us to the second part of the talk, focusing more deeply on China. Where is the pattern? So the US, for example, reports officially owning about 550 billion of common equity in the Cayman Islands. That one, we send it all away. None of it is clearly Cayman's companies. Where does it end up? Almost all of it ends up in China. So you can see that China in the official data starts at 150 billion and eventually gets closer to 700 billion. So it's really the Caymans moving to China. So what is going on is that pretty much every Chinese company you've heard of, technology companies like Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, all of those companies are Cayman-based. And I will explain to you why and why it matters. But one immediate conclusion is anybody who buys them in the official data shows up as having an asset in the Cayman Islands and not an investment in a Chinese company. And that one is leading us to underestimate as a community the exposure of these big developed countries to China through the equity market. So if you're thinking, for example, about the policy discussions in the US, but what if we delist these companies, or what if these companies get half in value because Jack Ma gets into a bit of trouble with the politicians in China, and you're trying to think, are there going to be big negative wealth effect on European investors, on American investors? When you look at the official data, you might be tempted to conclude no, that there is relatively little at stake. For the US, there's only 150 billion. That's very small compared to, say, US investments in the UK being over $1 trillion. But actually, they're an order of magnitude bigger. They're being masked, in our view of them, because they're being made in tax havens. And again, it's not just the US. This affects every other large developed investors. You can see that here I did the same thing. If you look at the official data, you will conclude that only 2% of portfolio holdings, or foreign portfolio holdings of the US are in China. So China looks very, very small from that perspective. But if you include the tax havens, you now conclude that China is 10% of all portfolio investment to the US. If you look at Europe, it's very similar. It's only just above 2% in the official data, but it's much closer to 7 or 8% once you take into account this business of the tax havens. So it leads to really a shift in how we're thinking about global risk sharing or global exposures through the portfolio flows and through portfolio positions. Now, before the rest of the talk goes quite deep into China, but I want to take it sort of slow and from the big picture first. The first thing I want to alert you to, and maybe this is already obvious to you, is that a lot of when you mention tax havens, the first thing that comes into people's mind is rich US companies like big multinationals of the US and wealthy individuals of the G3 hiding money somewhere or doing some shenanigans for tax purposes. Rarely, the first thing that comes to your mind is China. And I'm going to show you that while it's perfectly true that the US multinationals and wealthy individuals in the G3 are very heavy users of tax havens, China is now one of the biggest players in tax havens, and we haven't really collectively noticed as much. And let me explain what I mean by this. So let me start with this data point here. About 40% of all equity positions or all equity outstanding in tax havens is from Chinese companies. So if I look at who are the big equity issuers in tax havens, China should really be at the forefront of your mind. That doesn't mean that there aren't all the tax inversions of US multinationals into tax havens. Those are all there. It's just that China has grown enormously its presence in these countries. Back in 2007, that wasn't the case. China was somewhere above 10%. If you go back to 2003, it'll be 5%. So it is a very recent phenomenon, but it's now happening on a very grand scale. For bonds, it's less true. If you're looking at corporate bonds, Chinese firms account for only about 9% of the total outstanding in tax havens. But you can again see an incredibly rapid growth. So in a few years, this might be much higher than that. To understand why they're doing and why is this potentially a problem, I want to go a little bit deeper into the reasons. And in particular, I want to introduce you to something that maybe those of you that, because you're in South Africa, you're quite familiar with it, because Naspers is a big holder of Tencent. But if you haven't heard about it yet, I'm going to sort of introduce you to what is called the VIE structure. But let me start with the standard image. So the standard image that we have of foreign investment is that there is you and me, okay, and then there is Alibaba over here. So normally we think that Alibaba might be listed, for example, on the Shanghai Stock Exchange. You and I buy it, and it's a portfolio floor, a portfolio investment from foreigners. And then there is Jack Ma down here, and he also owns the equity of the company and controls it. Unfortunately, the reality of these investments is quite different. It's a much more complicated structure called a variable interest rate entity structure. And let me explain how that works and why it's in place. So let's start from why it's there. So China has a regulation forbidding foreign equity holdings in strategically important sectors. And all of technology is considered strategically important. So what the companies have done, they've used a sort of feature of international accounting standards that says that if you control a company and you are the residual claimant to its profits, even if you do so without equity, you essentially own the equity of the company and you can consolidate it in your balance sheet as a group. That is what is called a variable interest. So let me explain what Alibaba does, for example. Actually, a holding company in the Cayman Islands. That's a company that is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So you and I are here, or you and me, and we buy the listed company. The listed company then directly controls through a series of holdings a a company, or in reality, a number of companies in onshore China called a WFOE. What is a WFOE? Is a wholly foreign-owned enterprise. These are essentially companies that are operating in non-strategically important sectors like consulting, and are allowed to have foreign holders. Then the WFOEs have a complicated relationship with what you and I think of as Alibaba proper, as in the company in China. What do? Well, first, they will have an exclusive contract with the operating company for some service provision. For example, in the case of Alibaba, it might include providing consulting services on the company's website. And the fee for those consulting services is the entire operating profits of the group. So that one, you can see that is mimicking one feature of equity, which is the transfer of profits, the claim to the residual profits of the firm. The other feature that they need to mimic of equity is control. How do they do that? The WFOE will enter into a series of contracts with the Chinese owners. So for, for clarity, let's think of Jack Ma, that will sign over power of attorney. It will sign over, for example, call options on the equity of the operating company that are out of the money. Ultimately, when you look at this whole structure together, the following happens: that the holding company in the Caymans, according to international accounting standards, is going to claim that since he controls and he has a residual claim to the profits of the operating company in China, it can consolidate this whole structure. So when you buy a share in New York of Alibaba Caymans, you're really buying a share in the equity of the overall group. At the same time, the operating company in China will take a more narrow view of the same series of contracts and will say, we have no foreign shareholders whatsoever, because technically none of the contracts are equity. Now, we're by no means the first people to discover this. This is there's a long legal literature. Second, this is actually clearly understood from a practice perspective, in the sense that Alibaba tells you this is their corporate structure. What we're coming in is trying to figure out how big of a deal this is and how it has impacted how much we understand of global exposures, for example, to China. So let me start with the risks. First, I want to read you a statement that comes from the SEC Form F1. So when Alibaba listed on New York Stock Exchange, you had to file with the SEC the appropriate paperwork, and part of that paperwork discloses risks of the investment. And one such risk says, if the Chinese government deems that the contractual arrangements in relation to our variable interest entity do not comply with Chinese governmental restrictions on foreign investment, or if these regulations or the interpretation of existing regulation changes in the future, we could be subject to penalties and be forced to relinquish our interest in those operations. What they're really telling you in legalese is that this structure is clearly bypassing Chinese regulation, that China has so far been aware of this but tolerated it. But should they decide to change their interpretation of the rules or enforce them, you might be the proud owner of a company in the Cayman Islands with a very tenuous relationship that is unenforceable with the company that is actually generating the profits and owning the assets in China. So it is quite a big risk, particularly once you start to understand how big it is. And that's really where we come in. So let me remind you of some very basic identities that you all know. The net foreign assets of a country are assets minus liabilities, and the change in the net foreign assets is, roughly speaking, the current account plus the valuation changes. What I'm going to try to show you in the next 20 minutes or so is that these VIE structures are leading to an understatement of the liabilities because of missing valuation changes. So far in most of the talk, I tried to be very careful in only making statements that are bilateral. I said, it's not investments in the Caymans, it's investment in Brazil. But I try not to make multilateral statements for either the US or Brazil. So I didn't talk about the impact on the net foreign assets of the US or the total liabilities of Brazil. And the reason is, in general, it's difficult to make those statements. Why? Because the capital is making its way from the Caymans, possibly to Brazil, in ways that we don't see. And so it might be recorded in the liabilities of Brazil just under different nations. For example, it might be recorded as FDI or intracompany loans. In general, we're not making those statements because it's very difficult to have conclusions in the data about multilateral accounts. China and the VIEs is going to be the one place where I'm going to be more comfortable making those statements, and I will highlight why. So we're going to switch gears from reallocating the bilateral investment to consolidating all bilaterals and making statements about the multilateral accounts. Under the standard structure. If we were under the standard structure, China would have been registering a portfolio equity liability to the rest of the world when Alibaba is sold to foreigners, when its equity is held in foreign hands. And the rest of the world, for example, the US will have registered a foreign asset, a foreign portfolio equity asset in China. Now imagine that Alibaba, the equity doubles in value on the stock market. Then what happens at the end of the year or at the end of the month, the Chinese statisticians and the US statisticians will both look at number of shares held by the foreigners, multiply them by the stock price, and that will be the value, the market value of the liabilities. So if Alibaba doubled in price, so will the liabilities of China. Okay, it's a valuation effect. Unfortunately, that's not so straightforward once you have this complicated structure to tax havens. Why? Because what crosses the border is not a portfolio equity, but it's really a series of complicated contracts between the structure look very easy with only two companies. But if you look at what it is in reality, there's a constellation of companies in tax havens and a constellation of WUFIs, and they all have different relationships with each other as part of the same group. So valuing those transactions, it's a lot more complex. They don't have a clear sort of stock market value. But in particular, what this structure really does is that it delinks what China books in the liabilities from the stock market value of the Cayman company. And to be clear, this is not because the Chinese statisticians are doing anything wrong. They're not following the rules of the IMF International Balance of Payments. It has nothing, it has little to do with that. It has to do with the nature of what they have to book. So the US statisticians will keep booking a simple portfolio flow. They will say, I need to know how many units of Alibaba equity the American investors hold and multiply by the price of the stock in the stock market of the company. But the liabilities that are being booked instead are a series of complicated intercompany transfers or contracts among entities in the same group. And there is no reason why at the end this all has to add up. And in fact, I'm going to show you that's not the case. Now, from an economics perspective, it should. But from an international, from the way we compute the balance of payments and the international investment position, unfortunately, that doesn't have to be the case. So let me see how we reach that conclusion. First, here in the blue line, I'm plotting total FDI liabilities that China reports receiving from Hong Kong, the British Virgin Islands, and the Cayman Islands. These are the most likely countries to be involved in the VIE structures. The red dotted line is the stock market value of the VIE's company. So you can see that back in 2005, these companies were worth almost nothing. By 2017, they're worth more than 2 trillion. And some of that is equity issuance, but a lot of that is valuation gains. So even at this very simple level, you see that something funny might be going on. That at some point, the stock market value of these companies exceeds the total FDI liabilities of China towards the countries where these companies are located. But we can do a little bit better. So you see this period over here, this huge increase of $1 trillion. So this is a short period of time between the end of 2016 and the beginning of 2018, where this company is increasing value by $1 trillion, and it's all valuation changes. They're not issuing new equity. It's just that the stock market value of these companies is rising very fast. What we can ask is, if we look at the liabilities of China over the same period, did any of the liabilities move correspondingly? And what you see is that little or nothing moves. So, the only possibility left is that there is some other thing offsetting this by more than $1 trillion, but that's extremely unusual. $1 trillion is a big movement, even for Chinese liabilities. It is, we cannot be ultimately sure because we don't have access to the confidential data behind the balance of payments of China, but this is as close as we could get to a proof that these valuation gains are not being recorded in the Chinese liabilities. Are they being recorded on the asset side? And the answer is yes. So for example, if you look at the US equity position in the Cayman Islands in the official treasury data, you can see that it co-moves almost 1-to-1 with the value of these companies. Similarly, if you look at South Africa, FDI position in China, it moves 1-to-1 with a 31% share in Tencent that Naspers owns. So this is your official FDI data, and you can see that they're identical. Now, that isn't necessarily because the statisticians in South Africa or the US, despite the fact that they're lovely people and they know their job, they have an easier job. That's simply saying, I need to know how many Tencent shares does this company own and multiply by the stock market value of Tencent. What China is booking is something quite different from that because of this corporate structure. Now, ultimately, how big of a difference it makes? So here, the black dotted line is the official net foreign asset position of China. So when China says they are a $2 trillion creditor to the rest of the world, that's that line. Here I'm expressing in percentage of Chinese GDP, so just above 15% of GDP. So this is the big global imbalance that we've all spent a lot of time thinking about. A lot of for example, the policy time at the IMF over the years or in the US has been spent trying to bring this creditor position back towards zero. The red solid line is what we think happens if, or what we estimate happens if we correct the liabilities of China for having sold these very valuable companies to the rest of the world. So you can see that back in 2008, the correction will be tiny because these companies weren't very valuable. But as the valuation gains in these companies expand enormously and they're not being recorded, that means that the liability side of China is not going up enough. And so the net foreign assets, once you correct them, will start going down. And you can see that it opens a very sizable gap. By 2018, we estimate that China is $1.1 trillion less of a creditor to the rest of the world than in the official data. That's about 50%. That's saying that the Chinese net foreign assets are cut by 50%. This is, of course, a partial correction. What is really going on is that at some point you sold these companies to the foreigners, at least a good chunk of their equity, and that over time, these companies have become extremely valuable. And that's part of how you've done the global, the external adjustment of China. That's part of how you brought the creditor position down. As economists, we haven't noticed because of this particular way in which this has happened to the tax havens. Our claim is that if this had been straightforward portfolio investment with these companies listed on the stock exchange in Shanghai, this would have been recorded exactly the way we would think, and we would have seen a much farther shrinkage of the imbalance from China. It's also, it shows us something else which I think has been of interest recently. For example, during COVID, our profession has had for many years a conjecture that FDI is now masking portfolio flows. For example, Blanchard and Akelin have a paper about this. So imagine that a South African company raises capital in a tax havens through bond and equities. And then what it does is that it repatriates that capital onshore into South Africa via an intra-company transaction. Now that one in the official statistics of South Africa will appear as FDI. In reality, what is really going on is that there is a portfolio investment coming from abroad. And as long as an economist or a central banker, you're thinking, for example, as portfolio investment being quite different from FDI. Portfolio investment being, very flighty. As soon as there is a crisis, the portfolio investment gets out very quickly. And FDI, you're thinking of it as a long-term stable investment. These tax havens or these corporate structures are mismatching the views. They're making FDI very, very big, while in the back, what's happening is portfolio investment. And this Chinese case is a typical example of that. A lot of the holdings in Alibaba and Tencent are portfolio investment, but the way they cross into China is as part of intercompany groups transactions. So we think that this is probably happening much more generally, but in the Chinese case, we could see it clearly. Now, in the last 10 minutes, I want to sort of completely switch gears, and I want to show you other things that we do in the paper that are also online, and in particular, one that is sort of interesting is sales. So far, whether I use residency or nationality, I've always allowed one company to have only one nationality. So Alibaba is either Cayman or China. Toyota Motors is either US or Japan. But for some big multinational groups, that view might be too reductive or too restrictive. Indeed, we started with Toyota Motors North America accounts for 60% of the worldwide sales of the Toyota group. So maybe what you want to do is you want to assign multiple countries to this company. And one way to do it is to assign the nationality in proportion to sales. So if a company makes 30% of its sales in China, 30% in the US, and 40% in Europe, and you buy the equity, we're going to say that the equity investor has made a 30% investment in China, 30% in the US, and 40% in Europe. And we could do this, almost systematically. Coverage isn't perfect, but for the large groups, coverage is pretty good. And I want to show you how we do it. We use a data set from FactSet called GeoRevenue that essentially provides you this data on the geographical breakdown of group sales for large multinationals. And you could imagine doing exactly what we did before with the reallocation matrices and all that, but based on a different algorithm from residency and nationality, based on one that has to do with global sales. And there's a couple of interesting things that come out of it. First is that the exposure to China goes up even more than under nationality. Let me explain why. Suppose that you're buying European and American multinationals equity. If these companies are making a big fraction of their sales in China, then your exposure to China is bigger, not just because you own Alibaba, but also because you own, let me make it up, you own some European company, Anheuser-Busch, and it has an incredible amount of sales in China. So if China experiences a crisis and there's a collapse in demand, your exposure to that demand shock is coming through holdings of what looks like on paper a European company. And since in the data it does turn out that China accounts for a big chunk of multinational sales, that will push up the exposure to China even beyond what we see in nationality. The other effect that happens, you can see it here, is that home bias goes down. Why? Because one of the ways in which developed market investors get exposure to the rest of the world is by buying domestic equity. Domestic equity in this country is disproportionately coming from the largest companies in the country, which are multinationals, and their sales are very much occurring abroad on top of domestic. And so that one will push up how much resharing is going on, for example, around the world. So these are kind of interesting measures. I'm going to conclude now. I'm going to skip this. And then I'll be here for questions. What I try to show you is a project trying to provide a novel view of global capital allocations. And I think there are really two parts to what we're doing. One is methodological. There was this interest in tax havens for a long time. We took a stab at the securities component. There's certainly other interesting features that we haven't touched. But on the securities component, we try to provide a bit of a building block for other people to use to inspect it, to figure out that they can do better, that they can do it differently, they want to adapt it. But it's all online, and I hope that it gets used as a way to make progress on these important questions. And then, of course, the paper goes into the economics, and I think the main takeaway there is, at a very broad level, that the way we've been looking at the data now for many years, that it tends to be very heavily residency focused, it's a pretty poor description of global risk exposures, and increasingly so as tax havens get bigger and bigger. I'm not going to claim that nationality or sales are the ultimate answer. I think the right approach is really to figure out, to look at the data in all these different ways, and from each of them understand what is the economics of what's going on. And that one will ultimately offer us a much better view of how capital gets allocated, what are the risks, who's exposed to whom, than just always looking at the data in one very particular residency cut, which I think it's a little bit out of date. Clearly, this is the beginning, not the end. My hope is that the central banks will also pick up on this, and they are already. The BIS has done wonderful work. The ECB is getting to do work on this. So my hope is that a few years from now, we will look back and sort of think of these statistics in a different way, and really have different cuts of the data that make us understand the economics of what's going on. And I'll leave you with a lot of emerging markets have recently gone through a sizable portfolio sort of sudden stop. So you're well aware of the importance of knowing those exposures, and looking at them always in just one aggregated way is probably not the right way to go to do policy, to understand what are the underlying exposures. And hopefully this gives you at least a sense of what we could do about this. and there's certainly a lot more that can be done. Let me stop and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Matteo. It was fantastic. Let me start the video. While people collect their thought, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One is about the data set. Data set, you are looking really at the flows from developed countries around the world, or there is also a big component of flows from emerging countries to the rest of the world?
So the way to look at our data is really the investment side of big developed countries. So what we haven't done yet is look, for example, at how South Africa invests abroad. We've done some of that in particular cases. For example, in the Chinese case, we had to take into account the holdings that the Chinese residents might have of Alibaba and Tencent in the Cayman Islands. And so we've investigated those, but we've not done it systematically. And part of the reason on our side is, a bit of lack of data. So, if you look at our projects over time, we keep expanding what we see and collecting more and more micro data on holdings. And one of the things that, I would love to be able to do is to describe the investment side of, say, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa. We haven't done it yet. That's part of the reason why I was very hesitant to draw conclusions, for example, about the net foreign assets of South Africa, because we don't see both sides.
No, but it's also a sense of where the project, or for example, from the point of view of South Africa, where the project
something is going on here.
Send us.
Here's what's going on. I caught my green screen.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I thought for a second, I thought it was my son who was coming into the room and playing around with it.
He's welcome. He's welcome.
So
it's also in which direction also we can contribute to the project, in the sense of, well, what is that? Because obviously South Africa is in particular because it's got a lot of big corporation, and we had a lot of discussion about the investment that this corporation did in the rest of the world. And therefore would be quite interesting.
Here's some things that I find very interesting. First, let me say that the way I think about these projects is very much as academic prototypes that hopefully, if they're going to have any success, might get picked up by the policy side and from statistical agencies that might do this for their own countries on a grand scale and systematically over time. So you want to think of this as we're trying to do prototypes and figuring out whether they're interesting, what the issues are. Yeah. But even more so for South Africa, things that I think would be very interesting are understanding the intra-company transfers. So when one of these companies gets capital from abroad to a tax haven, how does it get passed on to onshore or to somewhere else in the world that might be operating in a third country? And understanding that sort of consolidated view of the company, I think it's very interesting for many reasons. That goes from portfolio flows to taxations through regulation. The other part that is interesting is, for example, Naspers is now a very big part of your foreign assets, as I understand it. They're one big international investors, and figuring out what they're doing and why they're doing it, it is interesting. One of the things that did come out of our data, although we haven't analyzed it necessarily as much, is you've seen it, it's dominated by the large multinationals. So that means that for some of these countries, these multinationals are a disproportionate part of the balance of payments and the IAP, which also leave, it makes idiosyncratic shocks potentially quite systematic. Yeah. And so that I think is not something that I've seen a lot of analysis on, and it seems interesting.
There's a couple of questions here. Given what you have uncovered, do you think evaluation of Chinese equity reflect the true value? Given the situation around Chinese regulation associated risk, could they be overvalued? Do Chinese investors also use tax haven to channel their investment? If so, how does that change the picture of the distribution of their exposure to the rest of the world?
Perfect. These are all great questions. I'm going to have some answers, but they're limited. So let me start from the last part, which is, yes, we have investigated Chinese holdings of, for example, these companies in the Caymans. we've done it two ways. One is by collecting data from Bloomberg on who owns the equity and literally figuring out which ones of these are Chinese residents. But the other one that I think goes through the use of tax havens by Chinese residents is by looking at the public reports of, say, Alibaba and Tencent. So in the US, you have, if you're listed, you have to disclose insider ownership of the company, irrespective of how it happens. So one of the nice features of that is Jack Ma owns very few shares of Alibaba directly. He owns a lot of shares indirectly through foundations in the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands together with the family. He has to report, or the company has to report to the regulators in the US, the consolidated beneficiary ownership. So when we say that Jack Ma owns, if I remember correctly, 6% of Alibaba, you really want to think of it as there are a complicated series of foundations in tax havens through which he controls that block of shares. And so that one is possible to do. What we haven't done is a systematic analysis of all tax haven usage by Chinese residents. That's a whole different project. It'll be very interesting, but it's not something that we even started to tackle. On the VIE discounts, so we haven't not looked at this, and in principle, is of course very hard to do because what you would like to see is a photocopy of Alibaba without the VIE structure, with a sort of straightforward capital structure. And of course, you don't see that. So you need a bit of a model to reach that conclusion. However, what I can tell you is when I Googled this, there's lots of articles from practitioners looking at what it's called the VIE discount, which has the idea that because these legal structures are complicated and might have limited enforcement, that might put downward pressure on the stock price. It's not obvious to me. I could also imagine a world where very few people even know that this is going on, or they're so excited about these companies that they disregard these risks, and there's no such thing. I don't know. I've also heard of, perhaps closer to home to you, I've heard of Naspers complaining about the equity value on Naspers being lower than the 30% stake that they have in Tencent. At market values or something related to that. And it's part of the reason why they now spun it off. I don't know enough about this to make strong statements, but it's certainly possible.
Another question. How does this novel research reconcile with the debate about the role of push factors versus pull factors as drivers of capital?
So I don't think we have a formal answer yet. I think we're sort of starting the work that hopefully is careful work precisely to get to that. The closest I think we got to that question is what I was mentioning about FDI versus portfolio flow. So here's a conjecture, which at this point it's just a bit of a wild conjecture, but I think it's one that is useful to discuss, particularly with you as a policymaker in an emerging market central bank. As you know, there's been this view that portfolio flow is very flighty, it's very risky, and that FDI is a more stable long-term investment. And often this has led to differential regulation, for example, to differential capital controls on the two. Imagine that what might be happening is the companies are responding by raising the capital abroad via portfolio flow, so they're issuing bonds. And then what they do is that they make a loan to the mother company. And that loan gets registered as FDI debt because it's one big chunky loan between two companies in the same group. Now, what that one might give you a false sense of confidence that the external liabilities are very driven by long-term debt FDI, while what that one is really masking is portfolio flows and in bonds. And if and so that might lead to somewhat of a self-fulfilling bias if, for example, the following were to happen. Suppose that there was a shock where the foreigners are flying out and the bonds of the company are falling in value. If the marking of the loan, for whatever reason, is not being updated in the statistics, that might lead to what looks like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where FDI indeed looks very stable because it's not being marked down while the bonds are collapsing in value abroad. What's happening is that the equity value of the foreign subsidiary is collapsing in value. we can't prove this, and we've not investigated it. But I think it's something that when I look at the data came to my mind as if that's going on, we should know about this. And maybe once we do it, we conclude that that's not what's going on. But the possibility that it might happen is the understanding of sudden stops or for understanding of external fragility. And as researchers and policymakers, we should look at this seriously and know what the answer is. We haven't been able to do it yet.
I was thinking, should not this sort of mismeasurement somehow appear also somewhere else in the in the current account, the other side of therefore, if you have this such big mismeasurement of the change in the foreign asset position, does not this reflected somewhere else and what will that mean?
So the one case in which I think we do have an answer is the Chinese one, and I think where it gets reflected is in the missing valuation changes. So, delta or net foreign assets is current account plus valuation changes.
Yeah.
And it's that part that has not been recorded as much. Our estimate is that if those corporate structures weren't there and Alibaba had the standard portfolio investment, what would have happened is China would have recorded a series of big valuation increases in its liabilities, exactly as I showed you that South Africa or the US have reported big valuation increases as Tencent and Alibaba went up in value. Yeah. And that one is the part that hasn't happened. Then, that one, I think we're making that statement. And then, the rest we haven't been able to do yet. But one of the things that, for example, would be interesting is to try to reconcile during a big sudden stop, how much should the current account dynamics are driven by intra-company rearrangements, and how much are driven by a consolidated view. We don't know. Like all sort of decent research, you end up figuring out how little you actually know even after you did it. So I don't know what the answer is to that. The one thing that I do know is that we should know the answer because it matters. I mean, you've responded very heavily as a central bank to outflows and a sudden stop in March. But as you know, it is a little bit flying blind in the sense that we see some bits of data, but not a lot. And at the IMF level, for example, a lot of the numbers that came out about portfolio outflows were, I would say pretty provisional. They're sort of looking at mutual funds and other investors on the asset side of the foreigners. I think it's legitimate and it's what is available. I think all of us think that we can do better and we should do research to get there. They did the best they could, but profession-wide, I think we can do better, and that's part of what we're trying to do.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? That was fantastic. You will have a lot of traffic on the website from South Africa in the near future.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
I very much enjoyed speaking to all of you again. If you have any questions, please do reach out. We're sort of open to those conversations, and we're trying to do better. So please do feel very free to reach out to us and with questions or suggestions.
Thank you very much.